Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and from time to time we run little experiments in my worm bins, and today's check-in is with an experimental system. So the backstory is that I had at one point gone through my collection of vermicompost and used my screen to narrow down my collection to only the finest materials, and everything that got caught in the screen was set aside. And I ended up with a pretty good collection of what I've been referring to as castings, boulders, little chunks of material that, regardless of me trying to crush it and rub it and stuff, wouldn't break apart. So all that stuff was just sitting around, and I thought, you know what? Why don't I try something with this stuff? So I created a bin out of this stuff, which can be seen right here. It's now 72 days of age with ENCs, European night crawlers, living in them. And I challenged the worms to do something with that stuff. And I've been keeping it really damp. And this is actually a fairly shallow tub right here, resting within a deeper tub. And the shallow tub on top is perforated, so I can add as much moisture as I want, and it'll all drain through into the sump. And we've been estimating, well, with everyone's input, we estimated that there's fewer than 150 worms living in here. We could be right, we could be wrong, I don't know. But because of the assumption that it's a fairly small population, we've been giving them pretty small size feedings. The last feeding was 12 days ago, feeding number 5. So my guess is that they're probably due. So let's get them up on the bench and see how they're coming along. So now most of their feedings have consisted of what you see here, coffee and or worm chow. And there was one time when we deviated a little bit from the routine of feeding them small particle size stuff, and I gave them some cucumber and some watermelon. Today I've got another chunk of watermelon. And this stuff here, this was just more of the stuff that got caught in that screen when I was going through my material. So that stuff was really sort of meant to be as a little bit of a reminder of the origins of this system. You can see we applied a nice replacement, fresh, new, top covering newspaper the last time we were in here. I can already see a pretty good sized depression over here in the middle, which is where we last fed. The way we applied the feeding last time was we threw in a little bit of paper, threw in a little bit of worm chow, threw in a little bit of paper, threw in a little bit of coffee, paper, worm chow, paper, coffee, kept stacking it up. And the bedding is going to be similar again, just some soiled pieces of paper towel and napkin. And most of the time we've fed down the middle. That time we fed cucumber and melon, we kind of offset that feeding from the center. And the center has always gotten a little bit of fresh bedding because we didn't want to end up in a situation where the worms would just, be unable to make use of the castings boulders as their domain. So I always wanted to make sure I had a little something for them to be in. And that's why I've always maintained this little haven in the center where they can have a bedding type material, and that's where their food would typically be added. And it does look like we've got a nice little collection of worms here. This looks like the type of stuff I usually pull out. Every now and then some sort of weird material gets into my shredder, ends up in my prepared bedding, and it's so weird because it's so few and far between, but every now and then I spot some of that. And last time we actually went through the entire system, kind of aerating the material, going around and inspecting it. And we did, in most cases, find a worm or two, like we found right here. I figure let's do the same one more time really quick. This, in a way, gives me affirmation that the castings boulders do have a little bit of potential for becoming a space for the worms to be in. Granted, we're giving them a much cozier spot right down the middle to be in by putting fresh bedding and food there. But at least by going around and finding worms throughout the material, I know that I'm not just dealing with a no man's land out here that worms are incapable of being in or making much use of. So many times I thought that perhaps I should start taking these little boulders, which, like I said before, were so hard and tough that I couldn't even break them or anything. But now that they're soaked, and have been soaked for the past 72 days since we launched this system, they do feel like they're a little bit easier to crush, break apart. But I mean, that would take some time to take every handful and take every little boulder and crush it and so on and so forth. So my hope was really that the worms would be able to break it all down to the point where it's all got the same smooth consistency throughout. Whether or not we'll ever get to that point is anyone's guess. I don't know, but it is what it is. We'll just continue on as long as we know that the worms are okay. I'm not going to be too concerned. Naturally, if we ended up with a bunch of worms dying or whatever, worms trying to flee, I would bring this to an end pretty quickly and do my best to get the worms out. But this is kind of a weird, interesting little system. So the experiment continues. Here's you can tell from the shininess of it, some plastic. I guess once in a while some sort of material sneaks in with the paper that I'm shredding, paper and cardboard that I'm shredding, but I've been lucky enough to be pretty selective on this stuff. So the comments for this system are always interesting. One person commented how they believe that there's probably more worms living in here than just 134. And I think another comment that I received was an interesting one, was to try to follow through with that same concept of putting a little bit of cucumber, a little bit of melon outboard of the typical hangout spot in the middle, and see if we can further try to lure the worms out into the castings boulders. So this is always promising to see. Right out here on the tip of my finger is the cocoon that some little wormy left behind here. Promising sign. Not always though. Sometimes I read into it a little bit more, wondering if, hey, maybe they're reproducing because they're concerned that they're in a crash and burn situation and they just want to leave some cocoons behind so that perhaps at some future point in time, if the conditions become more favorable, that cocoon will be able to hatch and produce some baby worms. But let me get on with our feeding, which I think is going to break away from the center focused style of giving them this little haven to hang out in and be in. I don't know what this is. I'm just going to take it out. The idea was to possibly start relocating the feeding zone over and over again, kind of like we've done in the past, where we go pocket feedings or ping pong feedings back and forth. And I thought that perhaps we would try that. So I think I'm opting for the ping pong style, just sending the worms from one edge of the bin to the other, kind of forcing them through the entire mass of material to get to the latest and greatest feeding, where all the freshly added bedding and food are. So now there's no way to know if this is the same cocoon. It seems unlikely, considering. But that right there is another cocoon. I remember when I first started, I would never, ever, ever be able to spot those things. And I'm still kind of in that same situation. I have a hard time seeing them, but once in a while they just stand out, especially in material like this that's pretty dark. Because the cocoons are fairly light in color in the beginning. They'll get darker and darker as the time comes closer when they're about to hatch, but in this type of material it is pretty easy to spot them. So I figured, you know what, let's try to grab all this stuff from the last feeding, this bedding material that had been placed in here for them, just so that the feeding zone does end up being all of the best materials that we've used in the past, leaving the rest of the system to be the castings boulders. And then we'll start alternating. Whether I'm going to do that again next time if we feed on the opposite side, I'm probably not going to try to gather up the material from over here to move it over there, but just since we are going to get into this edge fed back and forth ping pong style of feeding, I figured let's start out in a way that pretty much separates the material at large in the bin, the boulders, from the feeding zone. So this is what it's going to start out looking like. But it's not quite done yet, because don't forget I've got a little treat to cap off this feeding with. I don't know why cap off. I think I even used that expression a couple times in one of my recent videos. Capping off, capping off. I don't hardly ever use that expression. But I figured, you know, let's go ahead and start piling in some of this bedding type material that I bought down here to complement what they've already got. Luckily there's still a good bit of the leftovers in here. And then this moldy coffee can also go in here to complement the existing food. Almost making me question if we're maybe going a little bit overboard here. But even if we are, I'm just throwing in a little bit of worm chow and a little bit of pulverized eggshell as grit. And that's quite a feeding there. So I've still got a couple of these pieces of paper towel and napkin that I think we can cap off with. This might even be tissue paper. And that looks pretty good. So I usually like to try to cover up the feeding zones in my worm bins. Sometimes I wonder, you know, I see other people setting their feedings up in such a way that the stuff is almost practically on the surface, perhaps just a little sprinkling of bedding materials out on top. Sometimes I do wonder if I'm submerging my feedings excessively. But that is something I just sort of like to do. I don't know why. So I think I'm going to bring in enough material, just enough, with which we can cover up the feeding zone. And a lot of times I'll mark where we last fed, just so we know. But I have a feeling it's going to be quite obvious next time we come back in here. Let's get the spray bottle in here, because even though there's a good bit of moisture, I'm still liking the idea of keeping things super damp in here. And it also gives me an excuse to rinse off my glove and keep the materials that belong in the bin rather than taking them to the sink with me and rinsing them down the drain. And it also lets me tidy up the walls of the container here a little bit. I don't think I saw much, if any, flying insect activity, but last time we were in here we did also provide the system with a little treatment of the mosquito dunks, but even though I don't see any flying insects, I think just out of the idea of it being a good practice when you want to maintain sort of a preventative situation, kind of getting into the habit, if I don't forget, to add this stuff into all of my systems nowadays. It is pretty annoying when the flying insects start to take over. And you know, as far as feeding zone indicators go, we do have our trusty little reminder of the origins of this system, the screened junk that got caught, which I maintained as a little collection here. That right there can be our feeding zone indicator. So that's our check-in with the European night crawlers, doing this experimental setup here with the castings boulders. And the only thing left for me to do is to finish cleaning up and putting stuff away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.